my 2x2 for this lecture. I should play mini games for all of our programs, Madhu, where I'm like, all right, every lecture has to have a 2x2 or something. Okay, let me explain this 2x2. On the left, ideas that look like good ideas. And then on the top, whether ideas are actually good ideas. And the point that I'm trying to make here is there are times when something looks like a good idea, but it's actually a bad idea. And there are some times that things look like a bad idea and are actually good ideas, which maybe is like Airbnb, right? And you want to be careful about kind of like which one you think you're in. Now, obviously, if something looks like a good idea and is actually a good idea, fantastic, great. If something looks like a bad idea and is actually a bad idea, then also kind of like great. So these are what true positives and true negatives, kind of like that parlance. And what you want to be mindful of is like false positives and true negatives, right? What do they practically kind of look like though? I'm going to just start at the top left quadrant. So if something looks like a good idea, but is actually a bad idea, what it looks like when you're validating is it actually looks quite promising. And the reason why it looks promising is because you found an engaged initial user group who really wants what you're doing. And so you start working on the idea. Now, it actually turns out to be a bad idea because that was the only group that cared about it. So for something to be actually a good idea, it needs to be an idea that is like big enough to sustain kind of like a venture capital, venture backed kind of like startup, at least in our parlance. There's lots of stuff that makes sense in more traditional sense. And this happens sometimes. And actually this happened to me for our second company. I'll talk about it in more depth, but basically you find an engaged initial user group, things grow really fast. You kind of move on that. And it ends up being maybe not as promising an idea because outside of that group of people, they may not want it as much. Okay. I'm just going to go clockwise. Looks like a good idea and is actually a good idea. You found an engaged initial user group, and it turns out many other engaged groups exist. And so what this means is you can grow into quite a large company because you can just start conquering or invading each of these engaged user groups, and you kind of like eventually end up with all these people who want to use your product. So that's great. Looks like a bad idea, but actually a good idea. Maybe this is like Airbnb. You couldn't find that initial engaged user group, even though many of them existed. Right? So it looked like a bad idea, but it was actually a good idea. And then the final one, which is the bottom left one, looks like a bad idea, is actually a bad idea. You couldn't find any initial engaged user group because there are none. Right? And so I think this is like an interesting thing to think about. The one thing I'll add here, which I thought was the most interesting thing about all of this, is there are way more ideas. There are way more bad ideas that look like good ideas than there are good ideas that look like bad ideas. There's way more. If you look at the probability distribution in each of these quadrants, they are not equal. If you just think about the number of good ideas that exist in the world, there are few, right? Just as a whole, there are few. But there are many bad ideas. There's an infinite number of bad ideas, actually, right? And so if you're looking at that, everything in the rightmost column is actually pretty rare. For there to be actually a good idea is actually pretty rare. And for there actually to be a bad idea is actually like pretty common. And so the idea that for an idea to be really good, but for you to have missed all of the people who want that is like kind of hard to believe, right? I mean, look, it happens every once in a while, but like hard to believe if you just think about the probabilities of everything. For something to look like a good idea, but it's actually a bad idea is like easier to kind of like have happen, right? And so it was just I hadn't thought about that until I like wrote this out. But it like kind of was like surprising to me. And then I was like wanting to sit down and think about it more, and I had to go do something else. But I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. The other thing I'll point out is if something looks like a good idea, but actually turns out to be a bad idea, it's a huge time sink. Huge time sink. not only time sink, money sink. This is where all the VC money dies. This quadrant, right? This is where 90% of VC money goes to die. It all looks like a good idea. It's not actually a good idea. And look, you have to take bets. You never know for sure, right? But this is where VC money goes to die. It turns out that there are very kind of like, and good founders also end up in that quadrant. And so you kind of waste a lot of time there. I think and Airbnb is a good example of this. I think the bottom right quadrant is the one that gets all of the press though. So it makes it seem like the bottom right quadrant is very common because they get all the press. It's not common at all for all the reasons I just talked about. The top left quadrant gets no press because it's kind of like, it's not that fun to talk about, right? And so people think it's not as common. But the reality is actually kind of like the reverse. Okay, let me pause there. Can let that all kind of sink in. I know people had questions and they were like raising hands and all that stuff.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's like common amongst like actually a good idea is like, can you eventually expand to like find other users? How would you figure that out in validation? Is that even something to figure out in validation, stage of validation?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's kind of like the person who's saying that, hey, it looks like some of these groups might be interesting. That's why you're trying to find the like most interesting one first, and then you put the other ones kind of in your back pocket. When you are doing validation, if you do find multiple groups that are interesting, that obviously is more evidence that you might be in an actually good idea. You might be working on an actually good idea, right? Because you need these other groups of people in order for it to be that. You could make the argument that if your initial user group is large enough, it's like good enough, it's like sufficient. But if you're really looking at user groups with a high enough resolution, that typically ends up not being like true. Like if your engaged initial user group is just like everybody under 50, it's like, it's kind of just like, you just haven't kind of broken it up enough.